Today, we become legends.
Smite has been around a long time at this point, and we've had over 10 years worth of God releases that created the roster we know today. Some were huge hits, and some were gigantic misses, but today I'm going to rank every Smite season from worst to best purely on the gods released in that season. For the list, I'll be considering how the god released as well as how they are in the game currently, so gods that released broken, buggy, got reworked, etc. will be docked slightly, but I am putting a heavier weight on their sort of final end point in terms of their kit design and how they impact the game right now. Also, a quick disclaimer that while I will be considering quite a few objective factors like whether the release was OP or unusable, whether they got reworked and stuff like that, I will also be using my own opinion on what I personally think is a good god design, which you probably won't agree with a lot of the time. Just keep that in mind and let me know your own personal favourite season roster down below. But with that said, let's jump in at the bottom with the worst season ever in terms of god releases. So choosing an absolute worst season was a bit of a challenge, just as choosing the absolute best was. However, I do think Season 9's roster was a bit lacking for the most part. Shiva is just a really boring design with nothing super unique or interesting about him. Yu Huang is similar, just very basic and boring. Sure, his ult is kinda cool and you can make plays with it, but when you're 9 years into the game's life cycle, I feel like you need to bring something more than just 2-1 combo and movement skill. Lancelot is probably the highlight of the season for me, but even then, it's not like he's even among my favourite assassin designs, he's just solid. Ishtar is one of my least favourite designs ever and had massive balance problems on release, and finally, Maui, who is probably the best design of the season despite not being my personal favourite Guardian. Unlike Shiva, Yu Huang and Ishtar, he does bring some unique stuff to the table and doesn't really feel as generic. My next season is our most recent one, that of course being Year 10. This year had its hits and misses similar to Season 9, but does feel slightly better in my opinion. Surtur is fine, he's not really that unique and his ult feels a bit weird to use, but I do like him as a god. He's easy to play and his base kit flows quite well. Martikaras on the other hand is one of the worst designs we've had in modern Smite in my opinion. He brings almost nothing unique to the table outside of his bushes, which are either useless or absolutely broken depending on if you're average or insane at the game respectively. He also completely broke the meta for months before being nerfed into balance, which brings him down even further. E-Shell is just fine in my opinion, nothing too crazy or unique, but not a bad design by any means, just a little bit boring in my personal opinion. Charon is similar, just a very average design that can be fun, but doesn't really push any boundaries too far. Marman was the best release of the year in my opinion, and is one of few super interesting and unique gods released in modern Smite. She single-handedly brought Year 10 above Season 9 in my opinion. She did, and to a certain extent still does have balance problems, but once those are ironed out, I think she will stand as a great addition to the game. And finally, Bake Kujira is another boring god. He's fairly unique, but just being unique on its own doesn't really make a good god design. Bake is extremely boring to play against and not even that fun to play really. Definitely a low point of the season for me alongside Martikaras. Season 3 was a very interesting one in terms of god releases. With it being an earlier season, it has way more to cover than our previous two entries, which in itself does bump it up slightly. However, simply releasing more gods doesn't necessarily make the season good. The gods themselves have to be good designs, and I think Season 3 was very much a mixed bag. We had our fair share of broken releases like Skadi, Susano, Erlang, and Thoth, some generally quite boring, uninspired designs like Skadi, Jingwei, and Nike, as well as the infamous Morrigan release, who was practically unplayable for a while due to almost every match resulting in falling under the map or some other ridiculous game-breaking bug. That said, Season 3 isn't quite at the bottom of the list because it did have some good with the bad. Terra is an excellent design in my opinion, as is Fafnir. Erlang, Susano, and Thoth are solid once their balance issues were fixed, and the same with the Morrigan once most of her worst bugs were fixed. Season 3 was very much the embodiment of an average roster to me. Some good, some bad. Season 4 was a very interesting one. I think it's sort of the epitome of an average season in terms of god roster, even more so than Season 3. There were some great releases like Ganesha, Kukullan, Cerberus, Discordia to a certain extent, some awful releases like Artio, and some that released poorly but are now great such as Kuzumbo, Kurnanos, and Daji. Season 4 doesn't really have any of my favourite gods or any that I think are the best designs ever, but it had a large roster of mostly solid additions that after some balance issues on release definitely make Smite a better game to have them. Back to a more modern season though, season 8 is where we start to just get an all-round good roster for the most part. Tiamat is one of the most unique and interesting mages you've ever seen, Gilgamesh is simple but fun, Morgan also simple but fun, albeit a little bit frustrating to play against sometimes. Cleaner is super unique and interesting with not only her wall mechanics but also having essentially no CC but incredible damage and movement. Atlas is a great addition to the Guardian roster as well with a very unique and underappreciated ultimate. The only big miss this season is the elephant, or I guess sea monster in the room, that being Charybdis. I really don't like this design. Her 3 is extremely frustrating to play against and brain dead. Her ult feels like it barely works. Her 2 is pretty boring. I will say though, her auto attack chain and 1 are pretty cool. I just think so much more could have been done with this design, but she ended up just being a very janky and unfun weird mess. That said, she is the low light of the season and the rest of the roster for season 8 was really good, or even great in some cases, like Cleo and Atlas. Season 7 is actually quite similar to Season 8. It was another small roster, in fact the smallest roster we've ever had due to pandemic restrictions in 2020 hampering the release schedule. Mulan is fairly basic but definitely has a fun design. Baba Yaga, while her release was definitely a bit of a shit show given how ridiculously weak she was, once she'd been buffed and fixed, I think she's one of the coolest mage designs in the entire game, to be honest. Cthulhu is literally the most popular release of all time as per data from Hi-Rez, which is pretty cool. Tsukuyomi was sort of the opposite to Baba in that his release was ridiculously broken and almost ruined the game for a while, but that's a pretty common occurrence in Smite anyway, and once he'd been balanced properly, I think he's a very interesting assassin design. However, I think Danza sort of parallels Charybdis a little bit as the weak point of Season 7's roster. He's not as bad, I don't think, but I really don't like his design. It's a bit of a combination of being pretty uninteresting in general, as well as frustrating to play against due to his no DR jar and pseudo stealth mechanics. Again though, he was the weak point and most of Season 7's roster were great additions. The first season ever makes it into top 4. I did have a hard time placing season 1 since it simultaneously has some of my least and most favourite designs of all time. Kumba and Nox both came in this season, although Nox was reworked later on. There were also some really poorly balanced releases in this season, such as Cabrakan, Yanis and Nox being practically unusable on release, and Sylvanas completely dominating everything in sight for a while. However, I am putting more weight on where the god ended up and how they fit into the modern roster, and a lot of really awesome gods came in season 1 like Osiris, Yanis, Rama, Hu Yi, and one of my all-time favourite designs, Awilix. Overall, an incredibly solid season given how early on in Smite's life it happened. I consistently bring up Season 5 as one of, if not the best Smite season we've ever had, and the god roster was definitely a part of that. Achilles is super fun and versatile with several ways to play him. Chernobog is just a decent hunter design, nothing too crazy really. Baron Samedi is probably my favourite mage, or at least up there in the top 3. Pele is a near perfect assassin design in my opinion. Hera is sort of the miss of the season really. She's by no means the worst mage design in the game, but she's definitely not among the best either. I feel like more could have been done with the idea of Argus and she feels a bit generic to me. And finally, my boy King Arthur rounded out season 5 and of course I have to simp for him. He plays like no other warrior, has plenty of room for improvement despite what people say about him just being a button masher. He's my favourite god of all time and I simply can't stay unbiased when the one true king is in the picture. Season 5's roster was absolutely solid though, even outside of King Arthur, with only a handful of issues. Season 6 is one without many flaws in my opinion. Merlin, while he can be a little frustrating to play against sometimes, I think is an overall great design. Yhorm is super unique but does feel a bit like one of those gods that you just can't win lane against no matter what you do, which can be really annoying. Horus and Set though were the first and only double god release we've ever seen, which was super hype at the time, and I think both are great designs that add a lot to the game. Olorun is a very interesting take on a magical ADC. Persephone was one of the most unique mages in the game, although she did lose a lot of that with her rework, and she can be very frustrating to play against. Yemoja is a balancing nightmare, but is one of the few truly skill testing gods in Smite where you feel like your own skill on the god matters a lot. And Heimdall is just an overall solid hunter design despite some balance issues on launch. Overall, an extremely solid roster and probably the season with the most new and unique interesting designs we've ever seen. Season 6's roster did have some issues, but if you take the good with the bad, I think the positives massively outweigh the negatives here. And finally, my overall favourite season in terms of God releases, we have Season 2. This was of course one of the earlier seasons with an extremely large roster, which already bumps it up a little bit. However, as we saw with Season 3 earlier, a large roster is not everything. Season 2 is really a glow-up story if anything. I'm putting more weight on where the gods ended up and how they are today rather than nitpicking their release balance, which allows Season 2 to excel here, because oh boy, this season was pretty bad in terms of balance. Bellona, Medusa, Apwash, Ratatoska, Khepri, and Sol were all completely broken on release, with Bellona, Rat, and Sol all being top 5 most broken releases ever in my book. And on the other side of the coin, Raven's release was probably the weakest of all time, with an ultimate that did under 200 damage. However, when I look back at this roster, once the balance issues have been fixed and Raven have been reworked, this is an all-star list of gods. Bellona and Amma used to be my 2 favourite warriors ever, and are still up there, but maybe not quite so high nowadays. Raven, after his changes, is one of the best designs in the game. Khepri is always a fun time to play. Sol is a really cool and unique take on a magical ADC. Ratatoska, both pre and post rework, is a delight to use, though I have to say he was more fun pre-rework, but I can see how he was sort of unbalanceable in that state. And the rest in Medusa, Chiron, and Jingchen are all just solid fun additions. Apwash is probably my only complaint here, as he's pretty brain dead, cooldown spam type character with a lot of frustrating aspects. Given the sheer size of this roster though, it's amazing to me that only one is what I will consider a bad design, while several of these are my all-time favourites. Season 2 was truly a goated roster in my opinion, but what are your thoughts? Be sure to drop your own personal favourite season roster down below, and I'll catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.